How dare they violate my sanctuary with their filthy, destructive war? How dare they imprison me like this? 5 weeks it lasted, but it seemed like 5 years before the communists fell to the Republican forces in a savage barrage of hell's flames, massacring hostages and setting fire to state monuments as they abandoned their positions. In their wake, the Hotel de Ville and the Palace of the Tuileries were left in black smoldering ruins. Once more, the streets of Paris were burning. Since the opera had been used as a hospital for the Communard troops, it had so far escaped this relentless arson. But one evening, at the height of the crisis, I was driven from the house on the lake by a terrible presentiment of doom. Careless of discovery, I began to comb the vaults like a demented bloodhound, and there, in the third cellar, I found a member of the National Guard laying the fuses that would connect with a dozen barrels of gunpowder. "Are you acting upon orders from your commanding officer?" I demanded sternly. The man spun around in alarm, drew his pistol upon me, and took aim. "Are you acting upon orders?" I repeated with grim insistence. "Have you been told to do this?" "No!" He laughed suddenly, his eyes wide and staring with a blind lust that was immediately recognizable to me. "This place has been forgotten by the generals, but not by me. Not by me. I'm going to blow the filthy imperialist abomination off the face of the earth. But I'll settle with you first, my interfering friend." The Punjab lasso silenced him before he got the chance to pull the trigger, and I dragged his body out into the street when darkness fell, leaving it with others likewise abandoned. Then I went back for the gunpowder. Patiently, I ferried the barrels across the lake and stored them in my own cellar with a strange, secret pleasure. I had sunk my life and my livelihood in this splendid monument, nursed it from puling infancy, and caressed its beautiful stone and marble body like a fond lover. The National Academy of Music was mine, and I reserved exclusive rights to its destruction. If the day ever came when this precious edifice should be razed to a pile of dust and rubble, it would be at my hand that lit the fuse, and mine alone. Those tense, uneasy weeks of intrusion and unforgivable violation showed me the ruthless measures I must now show to take secure my retreat from mankind. To my original design, I added a torture chamber, an exact replica of the hexagonal mural chamber I had once built for the canoe. It was nothing more or less than a simple man-trap. No interfering busybody who found his way in would ever find his way out again, except through suicide. Sited beneath the substage area, with a trapdoor affording access to the third cellar, it was also a useful shortcut back to my house. There were more than 6,000 steps in the opera, and most of them led down. A shortcut would not come amiss under such conditions. Beneath the subterranean waters, I laid the cable which permitted a simple electric bell to give ample warning of intruders on the lake. And so my labyrinth was wired for death, a vast web encircling the Minotaur's secret lair. Let foolish, unsuspecting men step with care in the maze of my creation. All roads did not lead to Rome. Within a month of the Communard's surrender, omnibuses and fierces were playing the streets again, and prostitutes were soliciting once more on the Boulevard des Italiens. It was as though the horrors had never been, and yet Paris was altered forever, hardened and embroidered beyond measure by the taste of defeat. The death, Theros, of a proud city would never be forgiven, and hatred by the Germans was buried deep. Work continued on the opera amid all the inevitable delays and hostilities that were the aftermath of war and revolution.
with Garnier desperately fighting to complete a building which was now viewed with the utmost suspicion by the new government as an imperialist monument. By the time he had struggled through to reach the altar's inaugural night, I had already been many years snugly installed in the bowels of the fifth cellar. The house in Boisterville had been sold, and at dead of night Jules and I had ferried my mother's furniture across the subterranean lake. He had asked no questions of me, as usual, merely obeyed my instructions implicitly. But I saw the fear on his face when he found himself inside my unique apartment. I saw the sick, terrified uncertainty dawning in his eyes that he would never be permitted to leave this place alive. When the last stick of furniture was in place, he stood in my bedchamber staring hopelessly at the magnificent open coffin on its raised dais, the black mourning candles, and the funeral tapestries. "You're going to kill me now, aren't you, monsieur?" he said dully. "You're going to kill me because I know too much." I turned to look at his craven figure with sudden pity. He had been a man when I first met him, young and eager, ready to go out and leave his mark upon the world. 20 years of being worked like a marionette by the strings of my vocal cords had sapped all his initiative away and reduced him to the mindless cipher I saw him. I had deprived him of independence and initiative to the point where he was quite incapable of surviving alone in a hard world. In many ways, it would have been a kindness to have finished him that night, but I knew I could not do it. "Come here," I said. He came slowly, with a dragging step, head bent, resigned and unresisting. My throat tightened at the sight of his painful apathy. "If you ever speak of this place to anyone, I shall kill you," I continued calmly. "Betray my secret, and I will hunt you down, wherever you may flee. There is no place on this earth where you will be safe from my hand. But swear to keep silent, and I will raise your family in all the comfort you could ever have wished." He lifted his hand uncertainly. I don't understand, monsieur," he stammered. "What are you asking of me?" "If I am to live here in perfect peace, I shall require an agent in the outside world. You know my habits and my requirements by now. An hour before dawn on the first Sunday of every month, you will take a cab to the Rue Scribe and wait for me there. Whatever I need in my solitude, you shall bring to me. In return for that service, I shall pay you a salary of 10,000 francs a month." His mouth dropped open beneath its straggling mustache.
10,000! he gasped. 10,000?
I shrugged. "It is admittedly an exorbitant amount to pay in return for a little shopping, but you have 9 children to educate, and if one of them doesn't take the Grand Prix de Rome, I shall want to know the reason why. Of course, that does not mean you are to discourage any scientific interest that you may display. Medicine, for instance, is a very worthy calling. And surely," I continued softly, looking past him to the beautiful pipe organ which now filled one entire wall, "surely one of them will prove musical." He was stunned, entirely incapable of making any coherent reply. That ludicrous sum finally convinced him, as no empty threat could have done. He was dealing with a dangerous madman whose whims could never safely be ignored. The fact that I had no idea how I was going to honor this pledge indefinitely was quite immaterial. I would find a way. Before we parted on the bank of the lake, he hesitated for a moment, looking at me with an odd expression that I could not quite place.
"What will you do in this terrible solitude?" he demanded suddenly. "How will you fill the bleak and empty days?"
I gazed into the darkness of the great vaulted chamber, unaccountably disturbed by the question. I shall fill my days with music and scientific research, I murmured.
But you will be alone, monsieur, he persisted. Quite alone down here.
I have always been alone, I said. And leaving him standing on the bank with his lantern, I stepped once more into the little boat and rowed back across the lake. On the 2nd of January, 1875, I was examining the 8 counterweights of the auditorium chandelier for safety when Garnier appeared at my side. He looked both furious and deeply upset as he handed me a letter.
"Look at this," he muttered. "Tell me if it's not the final straw."
The letter was from Decoumont of the Ministry of Fine Arts, informing Garnier that 6 seats had been reserved for his party on the inaugural evening in the Deuxième Loge,
against the sum of 120 francs.
"What a bloody impertinence!" I exclaimed.
"I knew I could rely on you to think so."
He was obviously a little mollified by my open anger.
"It's an unforgivable insult, is it not? They want to make me look a fool, stuck away out of sight in such an inferior seating. They mean to humiliate me in public. Well, they can't go to the devil and take their miserable offer with them. I wouldn't dream of attending now. I shall stay at home and read a book instead."
"Oh, Charles, don't be a fool," I sighed. "Don't you see that's exactly what they want you to do?" There was a little silence between us. It wasn't until the words were out that I realized I had used his Christian name. He looked taken aback, even a little bemused, but his expression was not one of displeasure. Oddly enough, rather contrary.
"You have to agree this is a calculated political attack,"
he said uncertainly. "Of course it is, but you must brazen it out. Shame them all by attending, and you will be vindicated by your own achievement. I promise you. This is your moment, the accumulation of 15 years, enslavement to a dream. No one can take it from you now except yourself. Even if they choose to seat you in the cellars, you are still the foremost architect in France. You have to attend. If you don't, you'll spend the rest of your life regretting it, and regret is a very poisonous emotion. It warps and distorts every aspect of a man's life until there's nothing left but bitterness and despair. Don't let them make you bitter." He looked at the counterweights of the chandelier.
"Sometimes your compassion shames me," he said quietly. "Of course I shall attend. Will you be there, Erik?"
"Yes, you won't see me, but I shall be there, watching as your great triumph is unveiled."
"Our triumph," he corrected firmly. "Our triumph, Erik."
And to my great astonishment he insisted on shaking hands with me. It was a night to remember, the 5th of January, 1875. From my hidden vantage point high above the Grand Escalier, I watched the crowds arrive. A host of preening, posturing members of society lined the stairs of cantilevered marble, some of them the poorer for 1,000 francs, the cost of a ticket obtained through the unofficial channels of the open market. I, who had paid nothing for the privilege of seeing kings and queens pass beneath my contemptuous gaze, was amused by the blatant bowing and scraping I saw taking place down there. However, many monarchs and emperors she may dispense with. France retains a sneaking admiration for blue blood. The instinctive urge to crawl and curry favor with one's superiors is as ingrained as the stench of onion in a peasant's hands. King, emperor, peasant, It doesn't matter what they choose to call them. The undignified groveling continues in spite of the communes and the revolution. Equality, liberty, fraternity. They are simply illusions of the deluded poor. We were treated to beer that night. Meyerbeer, Rossini, and Delaby. I could see the audience scanning the premier loge with their opera glasses, searching in vain for a sight of Garnier. At the end of the performance, he was spotted as he descended the Grand Escalier, and there was a great burst of impromptu cheering and clapping.
"Bravo, Garnier! Bravo! Bravo!"
He glanced up at once toward the ceiling, as though searching for something. Then, overcome by the tremendous ovation, he bent his head and hurried out to his carriage, clutching his wife's arm. I was too far away to see clearly, but I know he was in tears. Recognition is sweet, and no one deserved it more than he. A great architect, a noble man. I was very glad the public had chosen to vindicate him in this spontaneous and exuberant manner. I felt neither jealousy nor resentment. The acclaim of men meant little to me now. I had outgrown my childish need for applause. At last the evening ended, and they all went to their homes. Those stuffed tailors' dummies and their mincing, overdressed wives. I was left alone in the silent splendor of the great double horseshoe staircase, lit by the huge candelabra on either side. King, emperor, god, I was now free to walk through my domain unhindered by the vulgar crowds. I walked all night, visiting every area of my kingdom, using my skeleton key to open and shut 2,500 doors. But when I crossed the huge main foyer with its 10 crystal chandeliers, I instinctively averted my eyes from the mirrors. These cruel instruments of suffering abounded everywhere in the glorious upper reaches of my palace, and a single careless sideways glance was all it took to give me a sword thrust of pain. But all beauty must have its imperfection, all happiness its share of sorrow. The mirrors reminded me why I was here, why I could never bear to leave this place and build again, as Garnier would. The urge to create had been burned out of me during those 15 years of ceaseless labor, and in its place there was only the need to possess, to have, and to hold. From this day forward, till death do us part. I knew that night that I had relinquished the outer world for good. There remained one little problem to vex my splendid isolation. 10,000 francs a month I had promised Jules in an insane moment of arrogance. I didn't need to keep that ridiculously extravagant agreement, of course. I had the power to hold that unfortunate little man in fear for the rest of his natural life. But I hated broken promises and dishonored pledges. I hated going back on my word. Disappointment is such an exhausting emotion. All that energy dissipated, first in painful hoping, and then in futile, hopeless resentment. It's like waiting for a birthday present that never materializes. Horrible! So, 10,000 francs a month must be found with some alacrity, or within 12 months I would be a pauper once more. And that really would rather annoy me. One grows accustomed to a comfortable income, you see. Money pays the edges of so many unpleasant situations in life. It makes one wonderfully independent, and quite apart from Jules, I had some expensive habits to finance. I liked to be tastefully dressed by exclusive tailors. I liked my cloaks and dress suits and shirts to be made exactly to my requirements from the very best materials. I wanted all the beautiful books in the world to line the walls of my library. I wanted the most advanced scientific materials available for my researches. I needed morphine and occasionally a little food. I should like to smoke salmon and caviar. Really, I could not possibly think of managing on less than 20,000 francs a month. Absurd. That sort of money was not to be had for the asking. Or was it? Suddenly I had the most wonderfully outrageous idea. The idea itself was not exactly new, only the application of it. Years ago, as I worked alone upon my secret passages, it occurred to me that what a mausoleum the size of this badly needed was a ghost. Ghosts are a testimony to the past. They give a building character, a sense of mystery and hidden allure. There really ought to be a ghost, I had said to Garnier with mock severity when we began work on the opera once more. He just laughed heartily, said the budget wouldn't run to one, that the minister would have an apoplectic fit at the suggestion. And how did one order them anyway? Put an advertisement in the Revue Theatrale, I suggested innocently. Oh, yes? He inquired with delight, losing for once those harassed furrows which had aged him 20 years since our first meeting. And how would I word it? Wanted. One ghost. Experience and good character required. I believe a distinct tenor would be considered an advantage. That ought to do, I said seriously. I'm sure you'll be besieged with offers. Yes, he said, wiping the tears from his eyes. I sure will be. A ghost indeed. Erik, I should be out of my mind by now without your droll little comments to keep me sane. A ghost. Yes, that's very good. I must tell that one to Louise. And he went off laughing. That was all I had intended at the time, to make the poor haunted wretch laugh. He'd been seriously ill for months during the occupation by the Commune, and he didn't look nearly strong enough to face the struggle that lay ahead with the Third Republic. The threats of the minister, the personal accusations of fraudulent malpractice and mismanagement that would continually be leveled at him as the cost of the opera spiraled upward. Yes, the ghost was no more than a joke at first, intended to amuse a sick man with many worries. It was only later that I began to see certain possibilities for myself. Wanted. One ghost. Experience and good character required. It might be amusing to apply for the post. After all, I did have experience. I'd been a ghost before, and a damned good ghost too. I'd driven my mother half out of her mind before I was 10, and then I hadn't even been trying. I had a vocational training, as it were. Surely this was a role which lay within my range. It was just a game to begin with, permitting myself to be glimpsed occasionally as I stalked the upper corridors, appearing and disappearing at will via my carefully concealed trapdoors and hidden passageways. A series of little tricks and illusions added mightily to my awesome reputation among the corps de ballet. Silly children, for the most part, who dearly loved to be frightened half to death by a shadow and a disembodied voice. Soon, they could talk of nothing in the dressing rooms but the ghost. Those who had actually seen me were privileged beings, entitled to respectful silence whenever they began to embroider their tales. Dreadful little liars, of course, all of them. But who cared? Certainly not me. There was no legend without artistic license, no tale that would not benefit from the fertile imagination of that storyteller. And what imagination those girls had! Better than mine, at times. Sometimes I took notes for future reference. So the game was already well established when I began to see how it might gain me more than a good laugh. The opera ghost was growing weary of his role as an unpaid amusement. Perhaps it was time he applied to the management for a salary. The more I thought about it, the better I liked the idea. The corps de ballet were already calling me the Phantom of the Opera. An intriguing sobriquet which appealed to me very strongly until I realized that it would mean singing my ransom notes PTO. Signing my ransom notes PTO. One did not wish to descend to the ridiculous. OG I became, and OG I have remained. But I still like to think myself as the Phantom. Looking back, the whole thing was quite criminally easy to arrange. I was blessed with 2 managers, neither of them mental giants, and one of them surely the biggest fool in the history of theater. Poligny. Ah, dear, credulous Poligny, your interesting little personal vices served me as well as your simple mind. I frightened you out of your wits that night in Box 5 when you first heard my voice. For after all, a ghost who knew so much about one's dubious private affairs had better be humored, had he not, particularly when his terms were so reasonable. 20,000 francs a month, and Box 5 on the grand tier to be reserved exclusively for my personal use. Extortionate. Hardly. A really efficient ghost is hard to come by these days, and no one could say I didn't give value for money in my own way. Poligny left Box 5 as white as a sheet, with instructions to write my terms into the lease of the Opera House. I expected a prolonged period of struggle, particularly from his partner Debigny. But one swift manifestation of my displeasure was sufficient to bring capitulation from them both. My reputation, swelling out of all proportion among the corps de ballet, had done most of the work for me. Everyone already believed in the ghost. It was unbelievable how quickly I obtained my power over them, and how seldom I was obliged to crack the whip in order to remind them who was the master here. A little magic, a little clever ventriloquism, and they were mine for the taking. Through similar means I obtained the worthy services of Madame Giry, the box-keeper, and with this old lady acting as go-between, I established an entirely foolproof system of receiving my unorthodox allowance. Oh, they tried to track me down, of course they did. But their consistent failure only increased their fear of me, and Poligny would not hear of involving the police. He had far too much to hide. Once the pattern of my life was set, my existence proceeded with ceaseless regularity along a bleak and empty continuum, entirely untroubled by emotion. I listened to endless operas and studied voice with cool composure. I wrote notes to the management whenever I had cause to raise some matter of grievance. A little missive from O.G., arriving mysteriously on a desk through the locked doors of the manager's office, was guaranteed to put Poligny out of humor for the rest of the day. Sometimes I complained just for the pleasure of winding him up like a clockwork toy. Occasionally, I even interfered with casting. I made sure that Madame Giry's little daughter, Meg, was promoted to be leader of a row. The child could dance as well as any of the others, and it cost me very little effort to make her widowed mother smile with pride. But by and large, I remained aloof and totally indifferent to the insolidity and mediocrity of the performances. Very few people went to the Paris Opera for the quality of its music. They went to see and be seen. I was indifferent to most things by that time anyway. Middle-aged, well past the angry frustrations of youth, a tall morning candle burning steadily down into a pool of black wax. All emotion and regret was behind me now. That I had willingly embraced the existence of the living dead. I never expected to feel anything ever again. 6 years passed peacefully enough. I knew because I had religiously marked each day off the calendar. It would have been all too easy to lose track of time in the eternal darkness and start the slow downward slide into oblivion, to sink into the complacent carelessness that would inevitably result in capture. I dare say I grow more eccentric with each passing year. but I was determined not to lose my faculties, or my fastidious social standards. Jules saw to it that my dress suits were kept immaculate, and that I never needed to wear a shirt more than once. The first room I had completed in the house had been my glorious bathroom with its exotic green marbled bath. Later I added a guest bathroom. Beyond the second bathroom, God knows why, I certainly had no intention of entertaining anyone. It would just seemed the done thing at the time. Yes, a full 6 years of reclusive, self-indulgent solitude passed before I had the first of a devastating series of shocks. I remember the evening very well. It was January 1881, and a cold, cheerless Paris mist had shrouded the city, bringing in early dusk. Seized by a sudden desire for fresh air and exercise, I ventured out into the dark streets. Come some considerable time before theatre hour. The hood of my opera cloak hid the mask, and thus attired I safely escaped notice from passers-by. To anyone who saw me, I was simply another frozen Parisian hurrying home out of the cold and the thresh of approaching rain. I had reached the Rue de Rivoli, and was brooding resentfully on the sad, blackened remains of the Tuileries Palace when a rising wind whipped away the last of the mist and began to drive storm clouds overhead. As I turned to retrace my steps, the heavens opened. Rain lashed down in torrents from the leaden sky, and within minutes the street was awash with water. When you can no longer bear to get wet with total indifference, you know you are getting old. I raised my hand imperiously to a passing brougham cab. The cab drew into the curb some distance ahead and waited for me. Almost immediately a man coming out of an apartment block on the same side of the road saw the cab and began to hurry toward it with an exclamation of delight. I saw nothing of him except his back, but he was wearing an opera cloak, like myself, and at this hour I could guess his destination with very little trouble. "My cab, I think, monsieur," I hissed with a hostility that made him step aside in surprise. Instinctively, averting my face from his gaze, I swung into the carriage, slammed the door shut, and rapped my gold-topped walking stick on the dividing wall. "To the opera," I said curtly, and sat back waiting to be obeyed. To my astonished fury, the door opened and the carriage rocked gently beneath the weight of the man who climbed inside. I looked up, but the oath on my lips never took breath. "Drive on, fellow," said this impertinent intruder calmly. "It so happens that I, too, am bound for the opera. This gentleman and I are very well acquainted, and I know he will be very happy to share the journey with me. Is that not so, Erik?" I could not reply. All I could do was stare at Nadir Khan with numb disbelief. "Will that be all right, monsieur?" shouted the driver uncertainly. "Yes," I snapped. "Drive on." As the brougham lurched into the open road, Nadir took off his opera hat and his gloves and laid them on the seat at his side. The first thing I noticed about him was his hair. Once black and luxuriant, it was now thin and very gray, making him look at least 60. I was shocked at the change in him, shocked and horrified. "Well, Erik," he said, "this is indeed a pleasant surprise." "That is entirely a matter of opinion," I retorted, trying to hide my conflicting emotions behind a fine veneer of sarcasm. "What the devil brings you to Paris after all this time?" "Oh," he shrugged, "I have been here for many years now, ever since I was released from Macedarian." "Released?" I echoed with grim foreboding. "How long were you held?" "5 years," he said with indifference. I looked out the window at the rain-lashed streets, and my hand tightened on the walking stick with a mixture of rage and grief. My God, 5 years in a Mazadarian jail. No wonder he looked more than 60. It was a miracle he had come out alive. And what on earth was I going to do now, faced with the one person in this world that I could not simply remove from the dark paths of my solitude? Invite him home. I couldn't. It was impossible. Unthinkable. We no longer existed in the same world. There was no plane on which we could meet now, after more than 25 years. Did you leave Mazadarian of your own accord? I demanded warily. Lydia laughed. Let us say I was not invited to stay. My estates were fortified, but I have been permitted to draw a modest pension from the imperial treasury in recognition of my royal descent. It has been sufficient for me to cultivate a taste for the opera. I hold a season ticket and attend as often as I'm able to. You don't have a box? I asked indignantly. But of course not. You shall have one without delay. I shall speak to the management at once. He looked bewildered. The management? Damn. What had possessed me to say that? I have some influence at the opera, I continued guardedly. Influence? I saw his expression change dramatically. I was one of the original contractors, I explained hastily. I built the place. Oh, I see. He relaxed and sat back on his seat, a look of delight replacing the quivering anxiety. Then such a magnificent feat of engineering must have won you many further commissions. It was not a feat of engineering, I retorted coldly. It was an act of love. I had no interest in further futile contracts on the surface of this earth once the building was completed. I could not think why I was talking like this. Had I taken leave of my senses? Why didn't I just draw him a bloody map and have done with it? Mercifully, the carriage stopped in the rank of the rotunda, and I opened the door, gesturing for him to get out. On the pavement, he paused to look back in surprise when I made no effort to follow him. Are you not attending tonight after all? He inquired, looking puzzled. I never attend the opera except in my official capacity. Surely your official duties terminated with the completion of the building. Some duties can never be relinquished, I said. I saw his gloved hand tighten on the carriage door. The suspicion in his dark eyes was now quite unmistakable. Erik, I don't like the way you talk of this. It gives me a very bad feeling. You had better hurry, I said, ignoring him. The curtain rises in 15 minutes, and I am impatient to be home. Where do you live? He demanded suddenly. That is no concern of yours or any other living creature. But it is nearby, he persisted. You directed the cab to the opera before you recognized me, so it must be nearby. I shrugged contemptuously. Still the policeman, dear. Still tracking down a scent like the perennial bloodhound. Old habits die hard, don't they? Don't think you can confuse me with your sarcasm, he retorted. Why should you hide your home from me in this mysterious manner? Have I not deserved your trust? Beneath the mask, I bit my lip until I tasted blood. I never entertained visitors, I said. Erik, he muttered with undisguised alarm. What are you hiding from me? What have you done? I leaned forward in my seat to fix him with an icy stare. This is not Mazadarian, I told him coldly. You have no jurisdiction in this country. Now listen to me, and listen very carefully. Do not follow me. I've warned you very seriously that anyone who tries to gain access to my house without my knowledge will have bitter cause to regret it. And you ought to know by now that my warnings are not to be treated with contempt. Remember the scorpion? Remember the scorpion and keep well away from my house. Do you understand, dear? Keep away. His hand slid from the carriage door, and he stood back with trance-like obedience. He made no effort to prevent the brougham moving away, but although I knew my secret was safe for tonight, I felt no complacency. Once before he had broken free of my control, torn down like the swaddling cocoon of sound with which I had bound him. Unlike Jules, he was not a natural subject. His will was too strong, his sense of identity and purpose too well developed. Whenever he chose to fight my voice, I knew I would be unable to hold him. I saw him so many times at the opera after that evening that I wondered how I could possibly have overlooked his presence all these years. I must have been going around with my eyes closed. He prowled around the building outside theater hours, questioning the hundreds of people who worked on the premises, making notes in a little black book, and generally making an absolute nuisance of himself. Persistent and efficient as he was, I knew it was only a question of time before he unearthed some very interesting answers, and my sense of unease increased steadily. One evening, roughly 2 months after Nadir first appeared on the scene, I returned to my house to find the alarm bell ringing. I knew there was no one on the lake, so it had to be the torture chamber. There was someone in the torture chamber. My heart gave a sickening lurch of fear as I considered who it must be. Turning off the electrical supply, I rushed into the chamber in a breathless panic. The room was still as hot as a furnace, but it was in pitch darkness now, and I could only dimly see the blacker outline of the body which swung from the iron tree in the corner. I stood absolutely still, paralyzed with horror, too shocked even to cry out. A great pressure seemed to have gathered behind my rib cage, and there was a curious numbness in my left arm. Why must the only victim of this virtually obsolete man-trap be my honest, stubborn, foolhardy friend? It was my fault. All my fault. I had known what he was like. I should have dismantled the whole device as soon as I knew he was on the premises. Dear, I warned you. I warned you to keep away. It was a long time before I could conquer my revulsion and horror sufficiently to cut the body down and switch on the lights. The black and distorted face and the bulging eyes were almost unrecognizable. It was a full minute before that I suddenly realized that I was not looking at Nadir after all, and my relief was so great that I began to laugh hysterically. Returning to the drawing room, I sat down at the piano and played Chopin's Prelude in B minor, sotto voce, until I was calm enough to go back and examine the body with indifference and rationality. The clothing alone was sufficient to place it now. I knew this man. His name was Joseph Bouquet, and he was one of the chief scene sifters. We had once had the misfortune to meet on the little staircase by the footlights, which leads down to the cellars, and since I had not been wearing the mask, the fellow had had a damned good look at me. He had been responsible for one of the few authentic descriptions which now circulated around the dressing rooms of the Corps de Ballet. How he had stumbled upon my secret lair I could not tell. Perhaps, in the course of his work, he had leaned against a mechanism that released a stone in the third cellar, or would have to alter the setting if that was so, make it more difficult to open. I really couldn't have people dropping in like this. I looked down on him with a little regret and a great deal of annoyance. Did I ask people to come here and kill themselves? Did I lure them deliberately to their end? Well then, I was not responsible for this death. I would not be held responsible. I was no more at fault than any householder who sleeps with a loaded shotgun in the house for fear of intruders. Besides, this wasn't murder. It was suicide. And if a man who wants to commit suicide, who am I to stop him? I did not like to throw the body in the lake, even weighed down. Dead bodies have an unpleasant habit of finding their way back to the surface when filled with the noxious gases of putrefaction. It occurred to me at length that if Bouquet had taken his life here in my house, he might just as easily have chosen to take it in the third cellar. And so, a few hours before curtain time, I took the poor fellow back there and hung him up neatly like a coat on a peg. He was old and no doubt had had a sad, hard life. I'd probably done him a favor. It was found at the end of the performance, but his demise excited little excitement. A policeman came, asked a few routine questions, yawned, and went away again. One more suicide for an unhallowed grave. That was all. Hardly a case that required the attention of the Paris Surete. I resolved to put the unpleasant incident out of my mind, but at the end of the week, when I went to box 5 on the grand tier, I found an envelope addressed for the attention of O.G. sitting on the ledge. I hardly needed to open it. I knew exactly what I was going to find inside. Promptly at 8 o'clock the evening, I rapped once on the door of Nadire's flat in the Rue de Rivoli. Derek showed me inside.
"So you are the opera ghost," said Nadir grimly. "You have no idea how much I hoped I was mistaken."
I took off my cloak and sat down uninvited in the fireside chair, taking in the paucity of my surroundings with appalled eyes. It was perfectly evident that he did not live in any great luxury on his imperial pension, and I remembered his beautiful estate in Persia with hot shame. I would never willingly have brought him to exiled and sadly reduced circumstances. Never. "You're not even going to bother to deny it, are you?" continued Nadir, outraged at my silence. I peeled off my gloves slowly and laid them in my hat. "What is the point in my denying anything? You've already tried and condemned me, haven't you? But I don't see why you're so angry. I'm a very harmless ghost as a rule." "That's not what I hear, Erik. The whole establishment goes in fear of you." "Oh, really?" I sighed. "A few silly girls and credulous old ladies." "And a management that meets your every demand." I frowned. "The world is full of victims and predators. Survival of the fittest is only the process of natural selection. Good Lord, you lived in Persia long enough to know that. And my terms are modest enough, all things considered."
20,000 francs a month is hardly modest."
"I have expensive tastes," I said. He made a gesture of angry despair and sank into the chair opposite.
"I risked my life to save you,"
he said slowly.
"I risked everything I possessed."
I tried to laugh. "You really mustn't take that to heart. We all make errors of judgment from time to time."
"I wanted to preserve your unique genius,"
he continued inexorably, exactly as though I had not spoken.
"Your brilliance, your enormous capacity for good."
"I beg your pardon," I said ironically. "I'm afraid you've really lost me there. I think you must have a wire crossed somewhere." Still he ignored my desperate banter, staring at me with a saddened disbelief I could scarcely bear.
"And this is how you repay my sacrifice," he said dully. "You become a ghost."
He looked about to weep, and suddenly I wanted to die of shame.
"Promised me."
He sounded as though he were choking on the words.
"You promised me you would not kill again, except in self-defense."
I looked away into the fire. The sound of the clock ticking steadily on the mantelpiece seemed to mock us both with its cozy domesticity. "I've tried to keep that promise," I said softly. His thin hands clenched on the arms of the chair.
"Well, obviously you didn't try hard enough, did you?"
"What do you mean by that?"
"Joseph Bouquet is what I mean."
I raised my shoulders in a non-committable gesture. The man committed suicide. The police are satisfied of that, are they not? Yes, he admitted grudgingly. Well then, what does that have to do with me? Nadir got up and came to stand over my chair.
Do you think I don't recognize your trademark when I see it?
How many suicides were there in Persia, Erik? Can you even remember? Can you? Or have you wiped it all out? Lost it in the midst of some opium-induced fog? Suddenly he paused, bending forward to seize my right arm and jerk back the sleeves of my shirt and dress coat. He stared for a moment at the mass of bruises which followed the lines of my collapsed veins.
May Allah forgive me,
he muttered.
This is my fault. You were ready to die that night when I came to arrest you. I should not have interfered. I see now that in condemning you to live, I did no service to you or the world.
I pulled down my sleeves, retrieved and refastened the gold cuff link, which his violence had sent spinning into the hearth. Do you mean to betray me to the police? I inquired with indifference. He laughed shortly.
Would I live long enough to do it?
I stared at him. It was a shock to find that even after all this time, words still had the power to hurt me. You honestly think I'm capable of that?
I don't know what you're capable of, Erik. Not anymore. Not with your veins full of morphine.
What are you going to do? I asked dully. What can I do? He demanded with resentment. What can I do that isn't going to haunt me with guilt all the rest of my life? Nadir. He turned his back on me abruptly.
Go back to the opera, he said coolly. Continue to haunt the premises if it gives you satisfaction to squander your talents in this extraordinary fashion. Blackmail Poligny as you will. From what I've seen of the man, I dare say he deserves it. But if there was one more mysterious death in that building, just one, I promise you I shall tell the authorities everything I know. And they'll find you. If they have to take the opera apart brick by brick, they'll find you wherever you have gone to ground. I mean to watch over you very carefully from now on, Erik. This is the last chance I shall give you. Next time, there will be no more reprieve for either of us.
I rose slowly, and, collecting my stick, hat, and gloves, signified my intention of leaving. Nadir stood back and let me pass unhindered to the door.
Erik.
I turned to look back at him, wondering if he saw past my cold dignity to the flayed remnants of my pride.
You could have been such a very great man,
he said sadly.
Distinguished beyond all other members of the human race. Such a waste. Such a tragic waste.
I went slowly down the shabby stairs and out into the street beyond. He had destroyed my complacency and my peace of mind, insulted, threatened, and humiliated me. Men had died at my hand for far less than I had meekly accepted from Nadir tonight. I should have felt angry, but I only felt sad. Sad and degraded beyond measure by the bitterness of his terrible disappointment. I wished I could hate him, but I couldn't. He was still my conscience. From that day he became my shadow, and I knew that every move I made beyond the lake would eventually find its way into that wretched little notebook of his. I found his persistence utterly infuriating, and yet, in its own way, curiously flattering, almost endearing. And eventually, to spare us both an intolerable amount of inconvenience, I agreed to meet him once a week on the banks of the lake, so that he might satisfy himself as to my continued good behavior. I'm not convinced that either of us was acknowledging his true motives for this regular ritual. Ostensibly, he was keeping me under surveillance, and I was jealously guarding my territory. But we smiled automatically when we met, and there was a vague feeling of mutual regret on parting that I was reluctant to analyze. I was beginning to understand that he was very lonely. He had acquaintances here in Paris, even some arrangement with a lady of doubtful reputation, to be honest. I was quite amazed at what he confided to me at times, but there seemed to be a great void in his life that he had been unable or unwilling to fill. After all these years, I don't think he had ever really got over losing his wife, losing Riza. "So there you are," he would say brusquely whenever I chose to materialize out of the darkness beside him. "You're late again. Don't you know I've better things to do than hang around here waiting for you to show up?" Actually, the truth was that he didn't have anything better to do, and I found that rather tragic. Christ, how could a man so innately good and kind as Nadir be reduced to voluntarily spending time in the company of a half-crazed monster? Why didn't he just have me arrested and put his misplaced guilt behind him? It was no fault of his that I was a murderer, an extortionist, and a morphine addict. The still waters of resignation that had surrounded me now for more than 6 years were being relentlessly stirred by his presence. I finally come to terms with reality and succeeded in constructing an ideal existence in which to live out what remained of my life in numbed indifference. I had my music, my inventions, a regular income, and I was contented. I was bloody contented. Well, suddenly I was afraid. I didn't want Nadir back in my life. I didn't want anyone. But I was glad to see him waiting for me on the far bank of the lake each week, and that gladness was a deep inward terror, because it meant I hadn't really learned to do without people after all. I had started to need his stern criticism, his serious conversation, and the occasional outraged laughter that I discovered I could still latent in him. I was groping out once more in the darkness. But sooner or later I knew that I was going to touch cold metal bars and draw back in horror at the sight of my prison. Once I admitted to myself that I could still feel emotion, I became vulnerable. I exposed all that painful scar tissue to the knife again, and I wasn't young and resilient anymore. I no longer had those remarkable powers of healing. I couldn't bear the thought of any more pain. My old interest in divination had never left me, and from time to time I still consulted the tarot cards in desultory fashion. It was a long while since they had revealed anything significant, but now of late each time I picked a card at random, it seemed to turn up death. Death, or the lovers. I could not interpret this cryptic message, but it seemed to be irredeemably bound up with a feeling of doom that was beginning to weigh ever more heavily upon me. I felt very strongly that somewhere beyond the lake a knife was being sharpened, owned to a gleaming point in readiness for me to run upon it in the blinding light of day. I was afraid, but I did not know what I feared. And so, even as I walked with Nadir, talked with him, rejoiced in the warmth of communicating directly once more with a human soul, there was a part of me that looked at him with wary suspicion and wondered what part fate had assigned him in this new, unrehearsed opera. Not the lover, that was for certain. I had seen enough girls leaving his apartments in Persia to be reassured that all his instincts were purely heterosexual. Death, then. Oh God, surely not his. I could think of no conceivable situation in which I would be prepared to do him harm. Nothing in this world that would make me commit such an unthinkable horror. But if it was not his death I saw, then it must be mine. Well, I was not afraid of death. I had spent the best part of 50 years waiting patiently for its release. No, it wasn't death I feared now. It was the other inexplicable symbol. 22 face cards in a tarot pack. Why was I suddenly so sure I should have turned up the fool? "You're very preoccupied today," said Nadir with severity. "I don't like the way you keep staring into space and forgetting to answer me, or flexing your left hand all the time." You're not trying to make me nervous, by any chance, are you? It won't work, you know. Don't be stupid, I said absently. My hand's gone numb, that's all. I'm not surprised, he muttered. This place is as cold as a tomb. I really don't see why you can't take coffee at your house in a civilized manner. I consider it most uncivil of you. He was right, of course. It was very inhospitable of me, appalling bad manners, in fact, but my house was my barricade against the world, and I could not bring myself to breach its defenses. Once he knew its secrets, I would be entirely at the mercy of his good intentions. It would be total surrender, a sort of captivity which I was simply not prepared to tolerate. I have to go now, it said. It was always time to go when the conversation turned, as it inevitably did, to the location of my secret lair. Don't wait for me here next week, I added. Why? He demanded instinctively. What are you up to now, Erik? The present management is retiring from office, I sighed. I expect to be rather busy for a week or so in consequence. He frowned. I should like to know just exactly what you are planning. Oh, nothing more than a little letter of welcome. You know, I consider it very poor-spirited of Poligny and Devigny simply to give up the ghost like this. Nadir's lips twisted at the verge of a smile, and then, as I watched, down came all the schoolmaster dignity like a stutter, just as it had done that night in Persia when I offered to teach him how to pick pockets. Surely you're not going to continue to play these iniquitous tricks on Messieurs Richard and Moncharmin? He sighed. Why not? It's been a very profitable arrangement up until now. I had hoped. For what? I laughed. A change of heart and some maudlin access of remorse? Confession, perhaps? He turned away abruptly. You make me very glad I'm not a Catholic, he said rather bitterly. Just remember, whatever you decide to do now, I shall be watching you. You're always watching, I retorted amiably. What a pity you never quite managed to see. And handing him his pocket watch once more, I left him alone in the darkness. I had made light of the matter to Nadir, but in point of the fact this change of management was a damnable inconvenience to me. I could not be sure that Poligny's successors would prove one half as gullible and malleable as he. And should they prove obstinate, my allowance could very quickly come to an untimely end. For myself, it hardly mattered. I had sufficient now to see myself out in comfort. But Jules had 2 sons at the School of Fine Arts, 1 at the School of Medicine, and 6 more children whose futures must be considered. I had no intention of abandoning my commitment to a man I had quite unwittingly destroyed. So I would have to tackle Poligny, make sure he passed on the terms of the opera lease before he cut his losses and ran. I needed to put the fear of worse than God in him one last time. A curtain note deposited on his desk would bring him quaking in his shoes to watch the evening's performance from Box 5. My voice would do the rest. We had been through this little farce of mine many times now. Nothing amused me more than the differential way in which Poligny approached the armchair in which he perceived my voice to be sitting. The earnest, anxious expression on his face as he conversed nervously with thin air, hid inside the enormous column of howled marble, which I raised and lowered exactly as I pleased. It was all I could do sometimes not to laugh out loud as I watched the absurd obsequies of his gestures. Sort of getting down on his hands and knees, he could hardly have shown me much more respect. He was indeed my very favorite victim, riddled with theatrical superstition and credulous beyond belief. It honestly amazed me that anyone so naive could possibly have any habits that would not bear public scrutiny. But there he was, a fat, stupid fish dangling helpless dangling helplessly on the end of my line. He had made my existence quite criminally comfortable, and I was going to miss him sadly. We should have one last cozy little chat before I said au revoir. I reached box 5 early in the morning. Well before anyone was around, there was a long uncomfortable wait ahead of me inside that hollow pillar, and since I was not eager to take up my position there a moment before it was necessary, I sat back among the shadows and read Madame Beauvoir and the Salamambo. They say the Flaubert became a recluse in order to write. I found that interesting. 2 hours later, having finished both novels, I turned at boredom to study last night's program, which had been dutifully left on the little shelf for my perusal by my worthy Madame Giry. Meyerbeer. Thank God I hadn't bothered to attend for weeks. There was a very commonplace talent if I ever saw one. A man who thought spectacular stage effects would compensate for the mediocrity of his music. The only things worth remembering in La Prophète were the roller skaters and the horse. At least Mozart knew that music must speak for itself. Don Giovanni, now, that was truly memorable. And the magic flute, charmingly whimsical, amusing. Although, of course, we didn't have anyone at the moment who could do justice to the Queen of the Night. I had yet to hear a soprano accusto suffocato who didn't sound like the whistle of a demented peanut butter. Mercifully, it was a role that lay well outside the range of La Carlotta. Really, that woman's voice left me stone cold. What a great pity our current leading lady never felt the urge to go back to her native Spain. I tossed the program aside with a gesture of contempt and studied my pocket watch with a sigh. 7 o'clock in the morning. Time was no longer visible on the premises. As I stood up, the newly installed electric lights in the auditorium were lit unexpectedly, and I shrank back against the hangings in fury. Damn them! Damn them! Who was it now? Not steam sifters by the sound of the high-pitched laughter. Silly, giggling chorus girls, no doubt. Ballet dancers escaped from the unending regime of rehearsals in the dance salon behind the stage. Normally, I would have had a little good-natured fun at their expense, giving them a new tale with which to terrify their wide-eyed colleagues. But today I wasn't in the mood for foolish pranks. I felt strangely tired and out of sorts. That peculiar sensation of constricting pressure was back in my chest. I simply wished they would go away and leave me in peace. A chord was struck in the orchestra pit. "Meg," said a girl's nervous voice, "for pity's sake, you'll be hurt, and then we'll be in trouble. You know we shouldn't be here." "Oh, don't be so spineless, Christine Daae. No one's going to hear us, except perhaps the Phantom." "The what?" "The Phantom. Don't tell me you've never heard about the ghost." "My dear child, what sort of dream do you live in? Everyone knows about the opera ghost." "No, don't laugh. It's true. Look, you see box 5 up there in the grand tier? That's his. Always has been, as far back as anyone remembers. It's never sold at the box office, even on gala night. They say it would bring terrible bad luck on the whole theater if it was." "How do you know all this, Meg Giry?" "Never mind you how I know. I just do, that's all. We know a lot about the opera ghost, Ma and I, but it isn't safe to talk about it here. And you better believe me for your own good. He doesn't like people who don't know how to show proper respect. And when he's angry, terrible things happen." "What sort of things?" I heard real alarm enter the other voice now.
"Awful things,"
said Meg cheerfully.
"Truly awful. The floor in our dressing room starts to run with blood."
Up in box 5, I blinked in surprise, amusement. That was a new one. Little Giry should be writing Gothic novels, not prancing around the stage dressed as a water nymph.
disembodied hands come out of the wall and crawl across the stage," continued Meg with glee. "And people just disappear and are never seen again alive, like Drissa Bouquet. I thought that poor old man hanged himself." "Oh, that's just a story that was put out rhymed by the management to prevent a panic. Everyone who knows anything agrees it was the opera ghost who did it." I frowned. This I did not like so well. Little Meg had better watch her wagging tongue. I had engineered her promotion to leader of the row. I could just as easily reverse that arrangement when I spoke to Poligny tonight. "Of course he's not always angry," Meg added absently. "Sometimes he's quite kind. Look, I shouldn't say this, it's a secret, but he's been very generous to me, to Ma, and me. He gave me a chance. Got Monsieur Poligny to notice me." Silent and resigned in my hiding place, I abandoned all thought of humiliating Meg. She was only a child. Only a silly, chattering, harmless child, who had no idea that she was annoying a cantankerous, aging monster. "It isn't the first time he's made changes to the cast, Christine. Ma says the opera ghost knows everything about music, and that Monsieur Poligny relies on his judgment entirely. Why don't you sing for him? Wherever he is, he'll hear you, and perhaps he'll make changes for you too." "Don't be silly, Meg." The girl sounded suddenly very uneasy. "Are you afraid of him?" "No, of course not. As a matter of fact, I don't believe a single word you've told me about him." "Yes, you do. You've gone as white as a sheet." "I think we ought to go now." "Oh, Christine, you're always so serious. You never have any fun. Listen, Ma says that Faust is the opera ghost's favorite production. You know the role of Margarita, don't you?" "Yes, but I haven't—" "Well, don't be such a wretched little coward. Sing for the Phantom, Christine. Let him hear you. Who knows what may come of it?" The girl sounded frightened to death, and I suddenly felt rather sorry for her. If she couldn't stand up to little Jerry's bullying, she had no future on the stage as a prima donna. Probably couldn't sing anyway. But I might as well listen. I really had nothing better to do at the moment, and I could always put my hands over my ears if it was too painful. I sat back in my chair indulgently, and as Meg, inept fingers, fumbled for the right chords, prepared to be quietly disappointed, the girl began to sing. I leapt from the chair as though I had put my hand upon live wires and received a fatal voltage. "Oh, how strange, like a spell does the evening blind me, and a deep languid charm I feel without alarm, with its melody enwind me, and all my heart subdue." Oh, it was certainly painful, quite unbearably painful, but I had no desire to put my hands over my ears. Perfect pitch, a crystal clarity of tone, no weakness in either register. This girl possessed a near perfect instrument, and lacked the inner will to play it. I had never heard a voice so sweet and true, nor one as utterly negative. Her boundless potential lay almost wholly untapped, like a rich vein of gold buried beneath the dead weight of strangling indifference. There was nothing there except faultless technique. She sang without soul, no expression, no joy, no sorrow, nothing. It was like listening to an extraordinarily talented zombie. There was something terribly wrong with this girl, a near extinction of spirit that made her voice affect me like a cry in the dark. She was dying slowly on stage, drowning in my ears. I couldn't bear to listen a moment longer. I must not think what I might have of that lovely, lifeless voice had it only been entrusted in my care. But first, I must see what she looked like. I must know, so that I could take great care never to listen to her again by some monstrous mischance. A second time would surely drive me right out of my mind. Forgetting my normal caution, I moved from the shadows to the velvet-hung ledge of the box and looked down. I looked out into the bright light of the auditorium's new electric globes, and the knife that I had dimly feared all these months buried itself to the hilt in my throat. Her name was the stranger's
unfamiliar and foreign. But she was not a stranger to me. I knew this girl. Beneath me now the horseshoe auditorium lay dark and silent once more, its lights long extinguished. For a long time I remained slumped in the armchair in box 5, risking discovery with a dull indifference. I felt as though I had been disemboweled. I was shaking from head to foot, and I could not get my breath. It had to be a hallucination, an optical illusion created by the lights in my troubled mind. The morphine was slowly rotting my brain and dragging me down into a morass of incoherent, impossible dreams. And yet, I knew what I had seen. I couldn't wait for Pulig now. I had to deal with him another day when I had my wits about me. I had to get away from this place quickly, crawl back to the safety of my lair, and hide like a mortally wounded animal. At no time during my entire residence of the opera had I been so vulnerable to discovery as I was on that desperate fight below. I blundered through the corridors, taking no heed to move with stealth, neither knowing nor caring who might observe my progress. My left hand was so numbed that the pivots of the stone in the third cellar refused to yield to me at first. I clawed at the mechanism with a cry of rage, and my fingers were bleeding before the stone finally responded to my clumsy touch and admitted me to the sanctuary that lay behind it. I vowed that I would never go back above the ground again. I would stay here, like a hermit crab in its shell, and drown myself in my music. Somewhere in the labyrinth of my mind I would find a grave deep enough to bury this shameful longing. If I burrowed fast enough, like a demented mole, it would be possible to escape from the pain. The unimaginable pain. Yet everything that met my gaze here in my precious home now filled me with bewildered horror. I saw as though for the first time that my room was a mortuary chamber and my bed was a coffin. A coffin! Everywhere I looked, my eyes recoiled in shock from the evidence of my chosen existence. I stared in cold disbelief at the residence of a corpse. What was I doing here in this tomb? I was alive. I was alive. I was alive, but I had never lived. I usually leapt from the pipe organ to welcome me, but now there was no comfort in the warmth of that soft, sleek little body. The touch of her fur was just a horrible mockery, and I turned from her fawning affection with revolted despair. Like a house with no foundations, unable to resist the first tremor of an earthquake, my existence had tumbled all around me in ruins. I suddenly saw that there was nothing left for me here, no refuge, no place to hide. Hell is not a place, it's a state of mind and body. Hell is an obsession, with a voice, a face, a name. I was obsessed with Christine Daae, irretrievably and disgustingly fixated with the desire to possess what I knew I could never have. It was as though I had lain nearly half a century in suspended animation, now woke to the ravages of sheer animal hunger. I tried to stand back and mock at my weakness with sneering detachment, to tell myself it was utterly decent to feel the lovesick yearnings of a callow boy of my age. But lust was an obscenity which must be scourged out of my hateful body. I punished myself without mercy for the wickedness of wanting. I set up a mirror and forced myself to look into it, without the mask. I withheld my morphine until I was shaking a wreck, but I still wanted her. I began to lie to myself, to cheat and deceive the other half, which cried out that this could not be, this could not be. Oh yes, said this newly awakened side of me with masterful cunning. I know all about that. I accepted that ages ago. I'm only going to back up there now to amuse myself. Truly, look, you can rely on me to be sensible. Have I ever not been sensible? Have I ever shown you up, made you ashamed of me? I think you might trust me to behave now. He was very strong, this other side of me, ungovernable and as wild as a stallion and terribly clever. I began to listen helplessly to this insidious whispering. You only want to see her, that's all. Just to see her. What's wrong with that, you gutless fool? Listen, I'll tell you what you ought to do now. And so it began, the shameless plotting and scheming to establish communication between Christine and myself. A series of minor misfortunes befell her succeeding dressing rooms, so that eventually she was wrestled exactly where I wanted her, in a long, disused room at the end of an unfrequented corridor. Here in this room, many years ago, I had taken the precaution of installing a system of pivots behind the huge mirror to conceal the old communal road, which led down to the lake. The pokey, inconveniently placed chamber was highly unpopular with artists, and is said to be haunted. I had driven out more than one hapless occupant with a little subtly applied ventriloquism. But I was glad of this room now, glad of the glass which showed itself to Christine as a mirror and to me as a window. Night after night, I stood behind the wall and worshipped her in silence while her dresser combed out her lovely dark hair. I saw her face gazing sightlessly into the little mirror on the dressing table. Her eyes were always distant and preoccupied, inevitably as sad as they searched the mirror in a hopeless quest for something that was never revealed. Often just before the curtain rose, she would sit very still with her hands pressed against her temples, as though listening intently for a voice you could not hear. I knew by now that her father had died some time back, that they had been inseparably close, that she still mourned his passing with an unnatural and unhealthy intensity. Such quiet, controlled, and yet infinitely destructive sadness made me ache to comfort her even as my eyes devoured her. I knew this child was not a natural survivor. The world would crush her under its cruel heel without compunction, never seeing the delicate petals that lay bruised and trampled in the mud. Spiteful rivals, unkind critics, ruthless managers, and dubious patrons. I cringed at the pain that inevitably lay ahead of her. Without the protection of a strong man, she would be destroyed body and soul by the brutal demands of a notoriously callous profession. The cruel familiarity of her features still stunned me with grief. She was lovely, wilting flower that I longed to rescue from the strangling creep of weeds. I wanted to plant her safely in the labyrinth beyond the opera house, to hide her from the world so that no one else should ever find her, hurt her, and take her away from me. I could make her grow. I knew I could make her grow, if only I dared to reach out and lift her from the barren, acrid soil that was stifling her natural talent, to steal her, to spirit her away. What madness! "Go away," she said rudely to her dresser one evening. "Mademoiselle, go away, I said, go away." Behind the mirror I stiffened in alarm as Christine flung into the room and threw herself down on the little stool at the dressing table. In all the weeks I had been watching her, I had never guessed she could summon sufficient energy and emotion to have a prima donna's tantrum. Something had happened. Something had roused her from her customary apathy and brought a flush to her pale face. "Beast!" she exclaimed, when the dresser had left, obviously just as startled as I was. "That fat cow! That mean fat cow! I don't sing like a limping sparrow! I don't! I hope you get nodules on your cords, Carlotta. I hope that every time you open your mouth you croak like a horrid toad that you are." I was almost smiling at this splendid animation, governing an absurd impulse to cheer, when Christine suddenly put her head down on the dressing table and began to cry like a lost child. "No, I don't wish that," she whispered brokenly. "I don't wish anything so wicked. God forgive me. I know it's true. I can't sing. I never could. Oh, Papa, why did you make promises you knew you couldn't keep? There's no angel of music waiting for me. There's never was an angel of music. Why did you lie? Why didn't you just tell me I'd never be any good?" Behind the mirror my blood began to throb hotly, drumming intense excitement through my veins. She wanted an angel of music, an angel who would make her believe in herself at last. I'd been the angel of doom for the canoe. There was no reason in the world why I could not be the angel of music for Christine. I couldn't hope to be a man to her. I couldn't ever be a real, breathing, living man waking at her side and reaching out for her. But I could be her angel. My voice was my one beauty, my only power, my only hope. My voice would open a magic pathway into her life. I could not steal her body, but I could steal her voice and wield it irreverently with mine. I could take it and mold it and make it mine forever, one little part of her that no other man should ever possess. All I had to do was break the silence that stood like a wall between us. Softly at first, infinitely softly, I began to sing an old heathen Romany song. The hollowed bricks carried the haunting melody relentlessly to her, permitted my voice to envelop her gently like a poisonous mist, seeping inexorably into her mind and staining her soul with darkness. I watched the dawning awareness of her body, like a snake, responding instinctively to its charmer. She rose slowly, and lifted her hand to my unseen presence. In her eyes, I saw a tremendous joy and bewildered recognition. It was as though she had been waiting all her life for this moment of revelation. Before the huge mirror she knelt with the humidity of reverence that stunned and momentarily into silence. I knew then there could be no turning back. Whatever the shadowed path might lead, we were both irrevocably committed to follow it to the end.